welcome everyone, and especially Jack Veitch from the Canadian Mental Health Association. I wanted to acknowledge right from the get-go that I'm sitting in territorial land of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederation, the Huron-Wendat, and the Wyandot Nations. Records of these people span over 10,000 years, and they show us a story of transportation, health, and commerce systems that were sophisticated and effective. As a settler, reconciliation is important to us because to create a healthy future, we first must recognize the genocide and the discrimination that Indigenous people have experienced over the thousands of years, acknowledge the harm Indigenous people have suffered, and atone for these causes. And then finally, actions to change. We need to change the fact that they don't have great access. They don't have sometimes access at all to clean water, education, protection of children's rights, and we have to end the violence. So with that land acknowledgement, I stand in respect of the Indigenous people. So Jack, it is great to be here with you again to chat about working with anxiety and what that means. Recently, we released a Working with Anxiety web campus course, and it's showing that anxiety since the pandemic has continued to increase. What's your take on that?
Well, Marv, I gotta say first, super excited to be back to get to chat with you, to work alongside you, the UFCW, again, an amazing group. And yeah, we're gonna start with a hard-hitting question, I guess. We're starting with this idea of, well, Jack, we're through COVID, or we're ahead of the hard spot. I thought, why is there still this strain and stress? And I always think of it from a couple lenses. I think first, an interesting note, Marv, what we see a lot when we see risk and mental health worsening, we see it often worsen throughout the spring. And this is historical. People think, well, why would people struggle during the spring? And what we see is that for those that are having a particularly hard time, they're coming through the season of change, of growth, of blooming. Everything around me is great. Why am I not great? And this sort of change that's happening, which seems to be so much better for everyone else and everything else, is not replicated internally. And that strife or struggle. And I think of that in the context of COVID. It seems like everything's getting better. It seems like I don't know if we'll say normal again. It seems like it's back to the way it was, more or less. Why am I not feeling the same? Well, one, maybe there's stress or strain we have not processed. I'll use that big T, trauma. Maybe there's things that we haven't been through or experienced. Maybe we haven't reached out to the care available to us. But again, I think to really emphasize, people aren't alone. It's hard. Marv, you mentioned it. It's hard for many.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's not odd to see it increase with the uncertainty as that increases. I mean, we take a look at climate change, the pandemic, wars, and genocide. There's a whole lot grabbing our attention. And I think a lot of these are eliciting fear responses. So I'm curious, that's not the only response. Anxiety can take many faces, and understanding it's not the same for everyone. So understanding a few of these might be helpful. So, when you see anxiety as the enemy, what are you looking at, Jack?
When I see anxiety as an enemy, one of my favorite terms I love to use is impairment in functioning. And it's this complicated way of saying, is it disrupting your everyday life? We're going to talk again about this idea about how stress is actually a really productive feature to a lot of our lives, to all of our lives. But when does it become problematic? When it impairs functioning. So that stress I've been experiencing. So I'll use us as an example right now, what we're doing right now. Maybe there's a bit of stress that's attached to this. I'm going on camera with Marv, who is well prepared. He is well read. I got to make sure I'm ready to go, and I got to be set to deliver. There's a certain level of stress that comes with this. But again, with that stress comes excitement and energy. I'm excited to prepare, to review. I'm looking forward to it. I'm excited to get on and see what we can put together. Now, if that stress, I couldn't sleep last night. I had difficulty eating. I was irritable, and my relationships were starting to strain. My wife's asked me about work, and I'm telling her, go away, leave me alone. We start to see some disruption present. And all of a sudden, that stress has started to impair functioning. When do I see a problem? When it interferes with those activities of daily living, the things I've got to do every single day just to get by.
Oftentimes people talk about anxiety as it's also free floating. So in other words, it would make more sense if you could see the threat and react to it. And because of that, I think a lot of times anxiety is seen as a secret. What are your thoughts on that?
It can be really interesting, can't it, for us to sort of say, you know what, there are some things, I'm certain if I asked you, Marv, you could identify there are things in my life that is stressful to me. I know that's going to be stressful. I know it's going to be disruptive. There's sometimes where maybe we're not even really aware about the things that are elevating our stress levels. There's sometimes it's not until we can take that step back and say, oh my gosh, this last week where I've been thinking about my talk with Marv, I've been really stressed, and it has really impacted even just the focus I have at work, my ability to spend time with my family. It's been weighing on me more than I thought it did. Sometimes we can have strong insight, and this is across the gamut with mental health. We can have strong insight. Sometimes our insight can vary. We can have difficulty having strong insight into our own feelings or emotions.
When we're talking about facing fear, and again, that's a common way of looking at anxiety, is facing danger and fear and threats. There's lots of ways of looking at it. One is to see it as acute. So it's there, it's in your face. You've got to fight, flight, or freeze, and there you are. But there's also something else that's going on behind the scene, that I think is important to surface, and that's the accumulative effects of fear, how it builds up slowly in the background. What are your thoughts?
Oh, wow. And, one of my favorite things to teach about is the idea of stress resiliency and sort of our baseline stress resiliency. Again, in the simplest form, just like you've identified with our fight or flight response, a stressor or a stimuli presents itself, our system enters into a peak arousal, elevated tension, hyper alertness, hyper perception. You use that elevated state for safety and survival. With time, action, support, our system sort of self-regulates and we carry back on to that resting baseline. When you mentioned this idea of chronic stressors, again, it's not like, the bear that charges out of the woods. It's not like, again, the exam I've got coming up. It's as if a stressor stays and remains. And as a result, our system remains in peak arousal, in that elevated state. And I always will try to teach the simple notion, we're not meant to be in that primal brain, that elevated state, to make really well thought out decisions. We're there to make fast ones. Brake, swerve, run, fight, flee, respond. You get stuck in an elevated state, it is very much long-term problematic.
Yeah, there's nothing really you can do about that feeling. Tim Box, one of the presenters, the TED presenters in the course, he talks about people feeling anxious about feeling anxious. And for me, that captured so much about, I'm anxious, but what am I anxious about? Oh, I don't want to feel anxious. And you just get in this cycle, and it continues to play in the background, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Oh my goodness. It's such a great point to make. And I think I see it most, at least in the work and the experiences that I've had, around sleep. And you see it very similar to sleep, I've got to get to sleep because I know I need to get up, but because I'm not asleep, I'm worried about not sleeping, and it's keeping me up at night because I'm not asleep. And we get into that cycle of insomnia. And guess what no sleep leads to, Marv? Guess what no sleep feeds in super well? Guess what loves having no sleep is that feeling of anxiety. And it just all snowballs downhill.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think we're going to be chatting about different approaches to anxiety. We're all hoping that there's a switch or a reset button that'll make it all go away. And when you realize that maybe there isn't, it's not to say that you can't reset, you can't relax. I think those things are possible with anxiety. However, the idea that somehow everything's going to be away and gone isn't typically what happens. Does that make sense?
Oh my gosh. It's the quick fix culture, Marv. I don't know. I don't want to sound like an old guy here on the discussion, but
no, I'm the old guy. Don't worry.
Okay, good. All right. It's that culture, though, isn't it? Of like, well, where's the button? Where's the magic sort of potion? Where's the approach? What's the thing I can do so that now I'll be okay? And then it's that reminder back that you said it well, there's all kinds of things that can be done, but they take time and they take work and they take effort and energy. Again, being well takes a lot of work, and it can be a lot of work. There's a lot of things I can do, but very rarely is there the, oh, hey, come on in. Because I'll tell you, if I had this switch in my office, Marv, the magic switch that you just flipped, I don't know, I'd be working once a week and I'd charge a lot, but it'd be the idea again.
Share.
It's an idea that's going to be work. It's going to take time, and that's okay. But we'll talk about those things too.
It is. You mentioned that not all stress is bad. And there's a really interesting, again, we're very proud to have partnered with the CMHA, Jack, on working with anxiety together. There's a really interesting concept called the dual continuum of mental health. And Jack, would you help me understand that a little bit more? It sounds like a $50 word. I'm sure there's an easy way to understand it.
Marv, I'm going to let you in on an inside secret. One of the tricks of the trade in social work, psychology, mental health care, we love jargon and short forms and acronyms because it gives us a little boost. But really, it's a $50 word in a 5-cent bag because it's such a simple notion. It's such a simple idea. I always think of it like this. There was this idea of a mental health continuum being this sort of spectrum between being potentially well or potentially unwell. Mm-hmm. And again, there were factors that dictated how we moved in that continuum: genetics, lifestyle, life experience, socialization, sleep, diet, etc. Then there was this notion of, okay, well, does that mean that every person living with diagnosed mental illness, they must always just have poor or bad mental health? And it was a pretty sort of clear sort of epiphany for many of, well, no, just because you live with diagnosed mental illness doesn't mean you necessarily always have bad mental health. So this dual continuum was introduced to really support that idea, that I can have strong mental health even living with diagnosed mental illness. And it's broken into sort of quadrants again. Living with illness, good mental health. Living with illness, poor mental health. No mental illness, poor mental health. No mental illness, good mental health. These quadrants broken down. And really, I think if I were to sort of get behind the brain of someone else, which is not probably something good for me to do, but if I tried, I would think, okay, the idea and the sentiment is, just because I live with diagnosed mental illness does not mean that without the right treatment, care, and support, I can't have fantastic overall mental health.
Yeah. And Jack, I want to affirm that. In my decades of work, I have worked with many good people who were going through a mental health decline. They were suffering with a mental health illness, and they were functional. They were able to, they worked side by side. And I think that's important to recognize, because the stigma, as much as I think we've made a good dent in it, for a lot of people, the idea of acknowledging any mental health decline is still considered shaky ground, specifically with who you're at. Some people you may trust more, but oftentimes at work, there isn't the level of trust that we would actually love to have, right?
Oh, we actually see, a lot of the work I do, Marv, and we've talked about this, really centers on workplace mental health. And I always talk about this idea that we only have essentially around a third of employees that are comfortable disclosing a mental health condition to their manager or supervisor. And whenever I do training for leadership teams or groups, I say, you know what, if we've got essentially 2/3 of a workforce that is uncomfortable or unwilling to disclose what they might be experiencing, how on earth can we ever build an environment where they feel supported? So much work is about venue.
You're making a lot of sense, and I'm thinking about the 250,000 workers UFCW has across the country, and this is a very real number to start looking at, because sometimes we have managers that are human and they treat us with respect, but when they don't, good Lord, that is a difficult place to be. Recently, the Canadian Standards Association released 13 standards for psychological health and safety, right? And you go through, we have them, lots of them on Web Campus. However, you go through some of them and you start recognizing how important this is. First off, if you're dealing with a mental health decline or you're dealing with anxiety, let's talk about the first one, civility and respect. You mentioned earlier that 2/3 don't feel confident to share that with management, potentially with stewards, people in authority that may be able to help. What does that mean? Like, how do you build that? What do you do with that?
Well, this is just it. And again, I always come back to employees, and there's so much I'd love to unpack this too, Marv. There's so much about, there is a duty to accommodate, period. plain and simple on the employer. And again, there's always two lenses I talk to employers about. There's a humanistic lens, there's a business lens.
Mm-hmm.
The humanistic lens is I'm very hopeful and certain that many, like you said, many leaders, they want the people they work with to be well, to be healthy, to do well. There's a business case to a lot of this. It is 1.5 times more expensive to replace your employee than to train up or support a current. Invest in employees. Again, it's the simple notion, Mark. A mentally healthy employee will be an effective employee. If you can do simple things, civility and respect. What a simple notion. Treat people with civility and respect, and we have evidence that'll benefit their mental health and wellness. And you know what? When they're well, they'll work better for you and help you better and help the whole organization grow.
Yeah, the capitalism has really let a lot of us down. When you see the number of billionaires and the concentration of wealth, and then you see the systems in which both workers and management function in. Again, we're very thankful for the collective bargaining, so we can at least have a say at the table. And civility and respect, I think, play a huge role outside of that process. Workload management. So in other words, part of what capitalism does is say there's never enough, there's always more profit, push, 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 push. How does workload management affect anxiety from your perspective?
That notion again, do more with less. Because if we can do more with less, revenue grows, shareholders grow, people, again, that's the model, essentially. And what we know is that when employees feel like they don't have the resources to adequately complete their work, it not only impacts the work itself, but it impacts the mental health and wellness of the employee. Again, even an employee who cares strongly about their work, is passionate about their work and their job. Again, I'll use you as I keep using you as an example, Marv, because you're here with me. But Marv, we're going to put this on together today, and you thought, okay, this is great. And your employer says, yep, we'd love you to put on this show. By the way, you're not going to have fantastic tech support in the background. You're not going to have a laptop or headphones or any electricity to do your job. You're going to think, well, gosh, I want to do a good job, but it's very difficult for me when I'm not given the resource. Mm-hmm. Workload management, providing resource and care, providing care to that employee, again, I'd rather them do one thing really well than try to do 100 things just strung to the bare bone.
I think we're on the same page here when you talk about workload. I remember having a discussion with a counselor who was doing some work with an emergency team in one of the Toronto hospitals, and for most of our jobs, I'm thankful that not every decision depends on me and someone gets to live or not. And too many businesses pretend that the sense of urgency is the same. And I think it's doing a real disservice to the people who are on the front lines of our healthcare. And in my conversation with him, he said that the team he was working with, and again, being proactive, they brought a counselor in to talk about the dynamics. And they had some interesting conversations until the chief surgeon died. And it was out of the blue. And the staff did not know what to do next because everyone was functioning, like you say, on this super high level, the middle of COVID. They're just going like nonstop. And what was really interesting was, the counselor was telling me, he said so many of them started to reflect, what's important in my life? Why am I giving up my life for something that is a system driven that needs to be changed, improved? It's not to say you don't contribute, but how much, right? Something's worth living for, not dying for.
I think, and that's so sad to hear. And I to the family, to the surgeon, that's awful, and the people impacted. And it's really unfortunate that sometimes it's those major events that often, not to say everything is with purpose, but gosh, what a chance to reflect and sit and think, okay, what are my values? And that's a lot of the work I try to do with people, with employees specifically. We talk about setting boundaries and limits. And so what are my boundaries? And they'll say, well, what should I set? And I say, I can't tell you what your boundaries or your limits should be, but I'll encourage you to have them and make them thoughtfully. Sitting down and saying, okay, like, again, I can tell, Marv, the work we've done together, I know you are passionate about this work. I know you don't even have to tell me. I know you are, just from the way that you work. But I'm still certain that you, to a point, have a line that's, you know what? this is my line. I love the work. I love what I do. And
Mhm.
I'm going to do a good job at it. But to this line, this is my threshold. And this is where it ends. And these are the priorities in my life. And again, however you decided to set those, I applaud you. I encourage everyone listening to do the same thing in their life. Set those lines or limits.
So I got a question for you then. What do you suggest to a worker who isn't feeling supported? They're working with anxiety, and here's the thing about anxiety: you very rarely can you look at someone and say, "Oh, they got anxiety." They look practically like everyone else. They're sitting at their desk. They're at their operating station. Wherever they're at, they're doing their job. What you don't get is the glimpse behind the scenes to the noise in their head that's going on background and foreground. So, what do you say to workers out there, and there are, sadly, that are experiencing anxiety and they don't feel supported at work?
I will, and again, first of all, to be in that situation, I empathize with people because that can be a difficult journey to be on. And I'll tell you again, the table that I'm often sort of teaching at is that leadership table. And what I'm
Mhm.
telling them
Yeah.
is there is a duty to accommodate and support. And I don't try to come off as punitive in that notion,
Mhm.
but I come off at, hey, if you can build plans to support your employees, they are going to thrive. They are going to excel. And I would talk to an employee and I'd say, first of all, if you don't feel comfortable, how much to, if at all, you decide to disclose a mental health concern to your employer is your choice and your right. Absolutely. What I tell my employees, the more open, honest, and specific you can be with me, the more appropriate, successful, and sort of specific a plan we can build together to help you thrive. But again, I can't build that plan at you, but we can build it together. And if I have an employer that is not willing to meet me halfway, I think having union supports and having those steward supports is invaluable because again, there's legislation
Mhm.
to support you on this journey. And again, I hope that you find an employer that will work with you because it won't just benefit you, it will benefit them, that collaborative approach.
Absolutely. Well, let's change gears a little bit, and thank you so much for that, Jack. And let's talk about handling anxiety. In the course, we go through probably the largest section of the course is ways of handling anxiety, and we're not suggesting for a moment there's a one size fits all. It doesn't. Each of us sees life uniquely. But there's three main ones that I'd like to get your thoughts. Basically, pros and cons, because I think the basis of any good decision is understanding the pros and cons, so you can decide what it is that you want. So, I'd like to talk a little bit with you about counseling, medications, and then mindfulness. But let's get started on counseling. Give us some pros and cons to counseling. It's not the be all and end all, but man, can it help.
Yeah, should we start with pros? I always like to start
Yeah,
positive.
yeah,
Okay?
go for it.
So I think about the pros of counseling. I think the pros of counseling, the first one I think of, especially with anxiety and reaching out for formalized care. And again, I'll preface this: counseling doesn't always have to be from, the psychiatrist, psychologist, psychotherapist. This could be spiritual,
Mhm.
cultural.
Mhm.
I think you said it best, Marv. Someone that you trust, that professional that you trust. Find the person you trust. Maybe that's a pro, is that it is flexible in finding that professional that you trust. I think the other benefit to having that external party to sit and help not just process what I'm feeling, but better understand what I might be
Mhm.
feeling. One of my favorite sayings, especially with anxiety, it's an old one. It applies to a lot of spots, but sometimes we don't see the forest for the trees.
Mhm.
Sometimes I just think, what is what is, and that's
Mhm.
all there is.
Mhm.
And it's not until I sit down and you'll be blown away so many times. I've got people in my life that went to counseling and they're like, yeah, I sat and talked and I told them how I felt. And the counselor, all they said was, is it though? And I thought back, oh, maybe it's not that way. And it was this epiphany where all the counselor did was sort of reflect back.
Mhm.
This is maybe something we can challenge. This is something we can look at in a different lens. The pro of having a second set of eyes just to look at something, that can be so helpful to get that insight that maybe we don't have.
What's the downside? Everything's got a downside. What's the
Everything's got
downside?
a downside. I
Yeah.
think the reality in any sort of person to person business is, you know what, Marv, sometimes people just don't click.
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't connect. And I've heard it a lot. I've heard it before. I went to a counselor. We didn't click, we didn't connect, and I get that. And what I'll often give back is that's human, that happens. That I'm encouraging people to shop around necessarily. Sometimes it's good to work with someone that will challenge you on certain things, but recognizing if it's not productive, if it's not helpful, it's not a good fit, that's okay, because sometimes it won't be. And maybe one more con, and if my dad watches this, Dad, if you watch this, I apologize, but I think about my dad, and there's certain generations that just are not comfortable in that setting. And they'll sit and they'll say, Jack, I don't want to sit and tell person X how I feel about it. And I don't feel comfortable in that. It's maybe just a comfort thing or a cultural thing where I don't feel comfortable. Those are barriers we could break down, we could cross. But again, there can be a con and sort of that fear of what it's going to be, the discomfort, or just maybe not a good relationship.
It makes a whole lot of sense. One of our featured videos is of Dawn Hubner, and it's a TED Talk about how she says learning to face fear. And she talks about CBD and how it was cognitive behavioral therapy where you become more aware of your behaviors and decide what you're going to do. She gives a wonderful story about her son and her being a psychologist screwing it all up. Not understanding CBD and then realizing through the journey that, like you say, therapy is learning is therapy. As she started to learn what mattered and she started paying attention to her own stress, her own anxiety, it made a whole world of difference in applying something. So what I hear you saying is there's definite pros, but the cons are you ready and are you willing to take those risks with someone who's objective and trustworthy? Right?
I love that. Are you ready to take a risk? Because you know what? It might be an uncomfortable conversation. It might be some work. It might be something you don't really enjoy at first, but it could have some real positive payouts.
Interesting. Something I heard a while ago has to do with risk and counseling. People who don't feel their own esteem often don't want to risk either. And I found that correlation quite interesting. So in other words, when we believe we're worth it, we're worth the risk. And we're talking about self-help and we're talking about, taking care and mental health. We're not talking about going to Niagara and gambling. So when I'm talking about risk, I'm talking about, am I worth the extending myself and taking that risk to grow, even though I may not hear everything that I want, I'm going to hear. It's something to propel myself forward with.
Oh my gosh, you may not again, that's one of my favorite things. You may not like the advice given, but if I'm ready to hear it, if I'm ready to try, gosh, you could go a long way.
Interesting. Medications. I was doing some research on this too, and the number of medications dealing with mental health declines and nervous system issues again just continue to grow. So give us some pros and cons to medications when it comes to anxiety.
I think a real, plain and simple pro is the evidence base and effectiveness. I mean, there is some real strong, especially in treating generalized anxiety and treating, again, a lot of different psychotropic illness with psychotropic medication. You talk about psychotic illness and depression. We've got all these different medications that have some really strong evidence of effectiveness. And I think I'd be remiss to say anything less that, again, there's other things that have positive effectiveness, but especially in some circumstances, to some level of disruption, medication may really be an important part of a treatment plan, not a piece alone, but a very important part of a treatment plan.
And that's really reflecting the con, right? Because I'm guessing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but that one of the cons to medication is thinking that this is a switch and I will see life completely different and it'll be just like I was before pre-anxiety.
You know what? It's so true. So I'm not going to speak to anxiety specifically, but I have this example. I think it fits perfect. Mm-hmm. So when we think about treating illness with medication, so I think about an illness like schizophrenia, for instance, which I can tell you with a strong degree of confidence, a person living with that illness will receive medication as part of their treatment. That's going to be a part. If we treat a person living with schizophrenia with just medication, their rate of relapse, becoming unwell again, it's just around 60 to 80%. Versus if we treat with medication and formalized care, so your family doctor, mental health worker, nurse practitioner, and informal care, family, friends, cultural, spiritual, church group, sleep, diet, exercise,
Mhm.
60 to 80% chance of relapse, 15 to 40% chance of relapse.
Wow, what a
One of the
difference.
cons of medication is the notion that it has to be medication and that's it. In fact, while medication might be a part of some people's plans, medication alone will never be the most effective course of treatment for anyone.
It's interesting because that works perfectly into one of the other pillars of handling anxiety, and that's called mindfulness. And in our course, we have a great presenter, Darren Larson, and the name of his talk is "Don't Try to Be Mindful," which is sort of opposite to what you think about mindfulness. But one of the points he makes in it, and I continue to gravitate and draw him back to it, is it's important to learn how we pay attention versus what we pay attention to. Could you unpack that a little bit? So there's a difference between how we pay attention and what we're paying attention to.
It's almost this notion of, I wonder if he's talking about things like dialectical behavioral therapy, about how your system's reaction sort of dictates action moving forward. So when I'm stressed, am I paying attention to the fact that, well, you know what? My chest is really tight. My fists are clenched. My breathing, I'm all of a sudden there's this insight. Again, we keep coming back to these words, these realizations of how my system and body is telling me I'm actually feeling, and how we can start to unpack that. And again, we see this as really effective form of treatment for things like trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, for things like borderline personality disorder, have really effective treatments in our DBT. Again, things that sort of help self-regulate by self-regulating system. Again, you talked about there's cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, how cognition impacts this.
Mm-hmm.
How does my system impact the way that I'm feeling? And again, I think just taking the time to sit and reflect of, how do I react when I'm stressed? What does that mean? What things help me slow it down? And again, it's breathing, Marv. It's always going to be breathing. And people, I go to anytime I go to students with bachelor social work students, and they're like, "What's like the trick, the magic word, the super secret phrase?" And I'm like, "You want the trick? Breathe. Just breathe." And they're like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Trust me. If you figure out breathing, and you've got about 80% of your career down."
Yeah. Some really good advice. So, when in dealing with anxiety, oftentimes there is time to relax, to retreat, to regather ourselves. We may be feeling weak, we may not be feeling on top of the world, and we're in control of the decisions we make. And just like there are those times, there's also times to consider stepping up, meeting a challenge, and taking a risk. One of the memes that I love is never trust your fear because they don't know your strengths. I think it's an interesting place to be, to sit with anxiety and recognize we are not anxiety. We're being affected by anxiety. With that, I want to close off with maybe a bit of a chat around self-care. So I guess I'd love to know what works for you, Jack, and what is one thing or two things that you recommend? Again, not to say that it's going to work for everyone, but what works for you, and what is typically something that you found has been helpful when you talk to others about self-care?
I think when I think about self-care for myself, and maybe it's because I'm not super type A, but I maybe drift towards that a bit in times of my life where I like to have things sort of scheduled and structured, and man, just scheduling in time for that self-care. And I find when I talk about self-care with groups or with audiences, that the biggest pushback that I hear
Mm-hmm.
is, I don't have time. I don't have time. I'm busy. I've got work. I've got family. I've got my kids. I've got pets. I've got responsibility. I don't have time. And what I'll always offer back to those people, and I'll offer it to you right now, Marv, as well. Marv, if right now, as we record this, if right now you got a phone call from someone in your life that you consider very important to you, an important person in your life, and that phone call said, "Please pick up emergency." So Jack, we paused, you picked up the phone, and they said, "You know what, Marv, I'm not good right now. I need your help. Can you come and help me out?"
Mm-hmm.
I am pretty confident that you would say, "Jack, we got to pause our recording.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to come back and finish this up because someone needs me."
Mm-hmm.
Why do we not show that same kindness to ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Again, you would be so quick to drop everything, that work, that responsibility, that you just told me was so important, when it was someone you cared about, you said, it can wait. I tell people, I beg you, take that same mindset for your health and wellness. It will pay out positively.
Yeah. And this idea that, it's supposed to be a switch rather than something that we grow in. Again, I came across a great meme. In the gym, the weight doesn't get any easier to lift. You just get stronger. And I think, that idea of how we, self-care and handling anxiety, we do gain insights when we pay attention. And does it mean that everything goes away? No. But does it mean as we feel the opportunity to invest in ourselves, take that risk, take that challenge, see what happens? And by the way, Jack, I think you're absolutely correct. Earlier in the webinar, yeah, I was nervous. I get nervous and I get stressed beforehand. Most people may not be able to see that. I think maybe some of the people who know me really well might see a little bit behind the curtain. But the point is, there are things in life that are worth stressing for, working for, even getting through anxiety for, because they make our life meaningful and important. And that's that struggle, right? So when we're dealing with self-care, we want to live more, but man, the fear can at some point be freezing us. So in closing, what are some insights? What are some words of wisdom? What are some helpful hints that you could share with me and the audience regarding anxiety and working with anxiety?
I love the honesty too, Marv. I love it. I was super nervous too, but I'm excited. I'm excited to be here again. I think if I'm going to share anything, I think when many people speak to me, at least about anxiety and the anxieties they're experiencing, they often focus on the things they can't control. And you mentioned some of them: international incident, war, financial crises, public health requirements or constrictions or concerns, all these things that, quite frankly, we have limited control over. I will always try to ground people in what are the things you can control. And so often it reflects lifestyle, sleep, diet, exercise, socialization and peer interaction, mindfulness activities, meditation and yoga, taking, like, again, I saw the course, the courses that you have published and promoted, taking the psychoeducation and support. These are things you can control. And like you said, it's just like going to the gym. The weight doesn't get heavier. You get stronger, and you got stronger not because you went there once, but because you went there regularly. It's the same thing. My 7-year-old right now is trying to get into the idea he wants getting stronger and lifting weights. Well, why can't I just do 100 push-ups tonight? I said, buddy, you won't be able to do it tonight. But I promise you, if you practice this and stick with it, there will come a night where you will be able to do it. But you've got to stay with it, and you got to put the work in. Mental health is no different.
It's the same for them. It's the same for us, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, Jack, this has been an absolute pleasure as per regular. I don't know when the next time is, but I look forward to it. And I want to do a shout out to all the workers, specifically the frontline workers that deserve respect. They are putting their lives on the line through pandemic, and they continue to by showing up day in, day out in places that sometimes are great to work in and other times not so much. So again, Jack, thank you so much, and the CMHA, our gratitude for helping us with this and being here.
Marv, thank you as always. It's always a pleasure to all those workers. Again, if this is your impetus to reach out and connect and do something for you, I'm thrilled and I consider it a success. And I look forward to the opportunity to chat again, Marv.
Thanks. Take care.